Thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So this evening, I'm delighted to welcome, for a long overdue chat, with Shayne Murphy. So welcome to the podcast, mate.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be on.
Thanks for coming on, mate. So anyone that doesn't know who you are, normal podcast style, a bit on your background, education, and what you're currently doing now.
Yeah, so I started as a sports scientist. So I did a sports science degree in University of Limerick back in Ireland. And in the third year of your degree, you can go on a work placement. So my work placement, fortunately, saw me at Cardiff City. So I spent 8 months over at Cardiff City. That was my first introduction to full-time football. So I finished my degree then. And when I finished my degree, I got a job offer at Blackburn Rovers. So that was a kind of an intern again with the first team. So I went over there first year under Mark Howard, and that was a great insight into that was the Premier League at the time. So it was really interesting to see how full-time in football works. And I spent 3.5 seasons there before moving on to Liverpool. I went to Liverpool's academy under Andy Boyle. And in that time when I was at Liverpool, I started working for the Welsh national team also in their under-19s and under-21 squads. I didn't spend very long at Liverpool. I was only there 6 months, and then I joined Man City. I was at Man City for 7 years. I kind of worked across many age groups, started with the 12 to 16s, then moved up to the 23s, had a bit of time with the first team, both men and women's, and then I've more recently just sort of left and set up my own company. So in that time I was there, I decided to hand in my notice and take the big leap of faith. And since then, I've just been running my company, which is SDM Performance. And I've been very fortunate this year to have a few sort of consultancy roles. So I remain a consultant still for Man City. So the City Football Group, as you may know, own Melbourne, New York, and Man City. And so I spent the first part of 2020, in New York with the New York City football team, leading pre-season over there. I came back, I started work for Setanta College, which is a university in Ireland, an online university. So I started to work for them, and now I'm a master's lecturer on their program. And then later in the year, I started to work with the Scottish national team. So I'm also the football scientist for the Scottish national team under Graham Jones as head of performance. So yeah, it's been a bit of a whirlwind leap, I think, since I left. But fortunately enough, things have kind of gone well, and I still remain a sort of performance coach, a consultant now for as I said, the three sort of the Setanta College, the City Football Group, and Scotland.
Nice. I'm not even going to give a mutual friend of ours, Rob Hayworth, any airtime whatsoever.
No.
Does not deserve it.
He does not. He doesn't. Who's Rob?
Exactly. But work placement, that was obviously a key thing that was set up with your university that allowed you to get your foot in the door.
Yeah, it was great. I think that's very important for students now. I think that's kind of like gold in terms of currency, trying to get that experience. And fortunate enough, UL and still offers that on the third year, go out and do a work placement. And I feel if I didn't have that at the time, I would have struggled to get to Blackburn, and then all of a sudden I would have struggled to move on and up my career. So that is a vital part of the developments. It's definitely a very good catalyst to get a job in the practical setting, I think. So yeah, that was the cornerstone really of my career, if you like.
How long were you at City? I know you're still there, but in an employed.
No, yeah. So full-time 7 years. It's full-time 7 years. So I started 2013 or the start or the end of 2012, and only last year I left at the end of last year. So yeah.
So that's many people's dream job, to be at somewhere like City in the academy or in the first team. So was that difficult for you to make the jump away from full-time employment with someone like an employer like City? And I suppose what were the main drivers behind that?
Yeah, there's two things with that. One makes it really hard to leave because it's such a good organization full of extremely talented players, first and foremost, really good coaches, and a very, very much development culture, even from the first team. Everyone's trying to improve themselves. Sam Harris and his team, the first team, and the medical side of things. Everyone's trying to, get sort of sharpen the sword, if you like. So it's a great environment to be in, and it's a very difficult one to leave in. But also having been in there gives you sort of the tools then to know that you have some standards, or kind of what good practice is. So it does make it harder to leave, but it also does help when you do leave, because you've been grounded and you've had to go through the rigors of tough managers. They say like Grant Downey, for instance, who puts a lot of pressure on you to try and develop yourself and develop the team and the people around you and stuff. So yeah, I think it helps you. The lessons you've learned certainly have helped me what I'm doing now, of course. But yeah, like the decision to leave full-time employment wasn't like something overnight. I didn't wake up one morning and think I was going to leave. It was a sort of decision that was a seed was planted about 18 months ago, and I sort of was figuring it out in my head for a long time before I actually finally made the leap.
What are the key lessons that you've learned from that process? I'm sure there's so many. I'm guessing when you're going through that process of thinking, should I leave? There's a big pull to stay, and not to say that it's a comfortable job, absolutely not, because you've got people like Grant who are testing you and wanting you to develop every day. But then you've got this big wide world out there of consultancy and potential insecurity, or how people would perceive insecurity. But what were the key lessons that you learned from that? Not only just the leaving, but the process before leaving and then finally making the transition.
Yeah, I think currently now the biggest lesson I'm learning at the minute is just it is more psychological, because when I first left, it was about like recognizing that my identity of being a practitioner in elite football or sport or whatever is now gone. You know, I have to accept that, like I'm not, because it's so demanding, 60 hours a week typically or more. 11 or 10 and a half months of the year sort of thing. So it is very demanding, and it's a big part of your life, and suddenly that kind of is removed. So what fills that gap? You know, obviously your business or what you're doing next fills the gap, but recognizing that you're not doing that anymore as a thing, you're doing something else, is the first step. And I know I don't want to trivialize that, because that's an important part of the process. And then after that, and you set up your own company, and then you've got a routine and you've got a way of working. One of the biggest challenges I have at the minute is like, not being too hard on myself when I'm not like on it all day, you know, because we've all had those days in work, in full-time work, where you're not 100%, you know, you're not your best self in certain days because life is happening and all that. But when you're working for yourself, you feel guilty when you're not maximizing your potential. Do you know what I mean? But in work, you get away with it. You don't really think about it. You're almost delighted you got away with a soft day. But when you work for yourself, it's different. It's a funny psychology with it. But then when you have good days and you make successful decisions or things happen, the feeling is far superior than anything I would have gotten. I think, you know, just working for a company, if you know what I mean.
It's all on you, isn't it? It's all on you. So you're the marketing person, you're the salesperson, you're the accountant, as we've discussed before. You're everything. I mean, one thing that I struggle with is forced periods of time off. Christmas being one of them.
Yeah.
You force yourself not to do any work because you're told you shouldn't be doing any work. But all you do spend your time doing is thinking about work. You're not doing anything, but you're thinking about it. So you kind of
course,
this weird middle place that just the kind of anxiety builds and builds before you then crack back on in January, and you're almost a little bit relieved. Like everyone's back at work. It's okay for me to be working. I can crack on. Is that something that you've found as well?
Yeah, very difficult to do, and I think I would have been like that when I was at Man City or Liverpool or whatever. Like even on days off, I'd feel guilty for you're not doing much. I don't know if that's what everyone works in full time, sport or whatever, or any role. You feel almost guilty for taking time off, and you feel guilty for having a bit of fun or something. It's so crazy. But I've gotten better at that since I left. To be honest, I relish the time with, say, friends or family now, which I didn't always get because I was in a different country, but also the job was very demanding. So yeah, I'm getting better at that sort of. It's definitely psychology, and it's definitely a mindset change. But yeah, that is something that used to always play in my mind. But I've worked on it, I guess. I've worked on being normal. If that's the way of saying it. Yeah.
100%. I mean, it's so funny you should say that about being normal, because when I left full-time football 5 or 6 years ago, I ended up going back to the club in a different role. And I remember speaking to the guys, the young lads, the youth team players that were still there, and it was coming up to Christmas, and they were like, "Oh, do you get Christmas off? Like, have you sorted out Christmas?" I was like, "I get Christmas off. Like, I'm in a relatively normal job. Don't
Yeah.
ever think that what you're doing is normal, because they
Mm.
won't get to know what's happening at Christmas until 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve.
No, no.
That kind of
Yeah.
situation. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's fine. Like, that's the world that you're in, but that's not normal. It's not
Mm.
good or
Mm.
bad. It's just that's not really how the world goes. Works, and just
Yeah.
know that.
Yeah.
I've kind of moved into a bit of normality. So
Mm.
it's a strange transition for sure.
It is. It's funny how quickly you forget too. You forget the amount of hours that you used to do, and you forget the sort of I don't want to say new normal because that's branded around far too often at the minute. But you forget like what is now your life. You forget what you used to have: the 60 hours, the travel every day, the missed family events and all that. And you sometimes just figure how kind of lucky you have, or good you have things now. You know what I mean? When you can get to spend time with the family more often and at your own leisure, like when you want to, you can do it. Like if I want to, if the time permits, if I wanted to play a game of golf with my dad, for instance, I don't have to ask 7 people to get a day off. Do you know what I mean? So but there's also negatives to it as well. So like I said before, there's that psychology of allowing yourself to have a down day or a light day and not be 100% on it. So it's kind of pros and cons, I guess, to both situations.
Mm-hmm. One thing we chatted about beforehand was your title,
Yeah.
consultant, performance coach, and it's the consultant bit that everyone does feel. When people say consultant, it's always a bit like, "Ooh, am I comfortable with that? Is there a negative perception that you almost maybe think you're something that you don't want to come across as?" But
Yeah.
it's something that I think more and more people are considering, whether it's even guys who are early in their career, especially guys who are more further along in their career. But what advice would you give to people considering that removal from full-time employment to do potentially juggle a few things that are going on at the same time as a consultant?
Yeah. I don't think you should take the decision lightly. I definitely think you should think long and hard. Like, it took me 18 months, probably longer really, if I'm being honest, but definitely 18 months of proper thinking about it. And I do think you have to do the due diligence there, because it's quite scary it's liberating, but it's also quite scary when you do it. And I would think you would need some sort of a plan if you're going to make that leap of faith. And it also depends on your own personal circumstance. If you've got a dependent, or you're in a different situation in your life, then that's obviously something to be considered as well. But look, in every decision in life, there's every action you make, there'll be a consequence, good or bad, and I think you got to be comfortable with that as well. I did it a lot of the time because I felt, say, at my role at Man City, not that there was other roles maybe that you could have pursued or looked into, but definitely the role I was in, I felt like I'd not maxed out it, but I was getting kind of comfortable in a way at what I was doing. It was a challenge, of course. There's always going to be a challenge at a club like that, but I kind of knew what I was doing pretty much. I just needed more. I felt like I needed more without sounding, anyway, kind of derogatory to the role or anything like that. But I just felt that I needed a change, and I didn't know what that change was. And then with that sort of opportunity about working with other people and other things and potentials and all that, and I did take a leap of faith. I didn't have it all set up. Like, it was like I met Graham Jones a few months after leaving. It wasn't like I had it all set up and then I'll leave once I have the Scotland gig or anything like that. It was far from that. And I didn't know CFG would allow me to be a consultant either. All these things weren't known before I left. But I guess if you have a vision, you have an idea, and you're willing to really work for it and go through the pain barrier, if you like, then that you're in a good place then, I think.
People will see like a Grant Downey or a Chris Barnes have maybe consultant in their LinkedIn profile or job title or whatever, and they've been around for a long time.
Yeah.
Would you say that people need to build up a relatively stable level of experience before making that jump? I suppose it all depends where you want to pitch yourself once you do leave. But do you think it's better to build up 10 years experience in the industry before expecting to then remove yourself and be touted by people who do want consultants?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Like you have to, what a full-time role looks like and feels like, and understand the challenges that poses. And yeah, for sure. Like, and there's no way I think, if I made decision 5 years ago, I don't think I would be now doing the things I'm doing. Maybe timing, and all that stuff, but I definitely wouldn't have the experience or the know-how to sort of do things I'm doing now. But I could have spent another 10 years doing full time and then left, and maybe I would have been better a consultant also then. But I'm fortunate enough, the way it worked out for me, that my development over last year has been more than if I stayed, because of the things I got to work across. But for sure, there's a difference, I guess, between, like, the word consultant doesn't always fit right with me, and we discussed and the only reason I say consultant is because I'm not full time. That's the only thing for me. Sometimes consultant has this connotation of, like, you see yourself as an expert or something. I far from believe that, and I don't feel like that anyone is really an expert in a field that's only been existing a number of years. There's people who are very, very good at what they do, but expert is a big word, and it suggests that we know everything, and we're far from that. Like, I think what we know and what we don't know, there's far more of what we don't know than what we do know. Now, what we're trying to do is trying to prove ourselves wrong as scientists all the time, is trying to figure out, look, what we're doing, is that right? Like, is it good for performance? And we're figuring things out. And sports science is a kind of a, it's behind physios in terms of how many years it's been around. So we're finding our feet in how we embed ourselves in elite environments, and we're definitely getting better. Tony Strudwick talks a lot about that. When sports science kind of exploded, we were doing all weird and wacky things, and now we're a bit more kind of streamlined. And I think the best thing sports science ever did was understand where it sits in the bigger system. We're a part of a cog. We're a small cog, that's just turning a big one. And if we start believing we're the masters of it, then I think we make mistakes. But if we can help and support what's trying to be achieved in whatever context we're in, then I think we're doing the right things.
It's just unfortunate there's not the word that really fits, because, like you say, that consultant word does come with maybe a negative connotation in this scenario. But not many alternatives, unfortunately.
No, I just see it as, I'm not full time with anyone. I'm just kind of a free spirit.
So next next 40 minutes or so, we'll dive into some more technical aspects of your experience and your knowledge. Human movement being one of them. And I've been recently going through past episodes of the podcast, and one topic that came up was my experience, and the guests who were on, guys from Championship football, had the same experience and been stood next to a coach, and he go, it doesn't move well, and you're like, what do you mean? Well, I don't really know, but I just know that's not right. And you're trying to kind of pull this information out, but the coach just knows that's not what he wants to see. So, I mean, from that particular, have you had that particular situation, and how do you then kind of pick that apart to try to mold something so that coach goes, okay, I don't know what it is you've done, but that now looks a little bit better or a lot better?
Yeah. That's it. It's a very good point. And the coaches, like, even though they may not have as much knowledge maybe in terms of movement and biomechanics and all that stuff and muscles and everything else, I think that intuition of a coach is so important. And we definitely, that's how I always want to sit, is next to the coach, understand the technical aspirations, if you like, of the coach, and then fit my philosophy around that to better the team, to better the athlete and stuff. So I think sometimes we have this idea, he doesn't move well on the pitch, and that's the coach's intuition. And then our idea of he moves well is like in a squat or a hip hinge or a pull or a push. And I think there is a big discrepancy between one and the other. I think there's a gap to be bridged there. And we, at Man City, we set up trying to bridge that gap best we could. So we talked about, like, the in the gym sort of scenarios of movement, like your hip hinge and your pulls and all that kind of stuff. But then also the on pitch movement stuff. Can we assess that the way we would assess a squat or a lunge or whatever else? And that was that helped bridge that gap between what the coach was seeing and what we were seeing. So we broke it down into, I can't remember, was it 10 categories? And we went like acceleration, deceleration, jumping was a really big one. I think that's a bad executed skill, jumping, like jumping off one leg in particular, and how to utilize the other swing leg to jump off one leg. I think that's an important skill to learn, especially young age, and max velocity is an important skill to learn at a young age also. But changing, cutting, change of direction, turning over your left shoulder, turning over your right shoulder. And also in football, what happens a lot is that transitional movements that we used to call it. So how a defender, for instance, like a centre back, will travel back towards his box if he's in, say, halfway between the 18 and the halfway line, how he travels and how he transitions back. So a back pedal, for instance, wouldn't be the most best thing. Okay, he'll transition that at some point, maybe momentarily, but if he's giving up space, traveling back pedaling, he's also marking someone at the same time. That's not a very economic place to be. Your center of mass is too high, you can't change direction quick enough, and at the elite level you're going to be exposed if you're doing that. And the best players, again, intuition coming into it, the best players see that. The best players see that they don't know consciously that, oh look, his center of mass is above his hips there, you know what I mean? They don't know that, but they know that intuitively, and they can pick up on cues on certain people, so they know when to make that run, for instance. So I think movement is a very important thing, but I think we have to get away from thinking movement just as a gym and then movement in on the pitch. And I think for us as sports scientists, we like our S&C coaches, we like to have a process behind what we do. We don't like being too fluffy, which there's nothing wrong with a bit of ambiguity, I don't think. But we certainly have to what way we thought was a good way to do it was to sort of classify different movements in the pitch, and that's football related. But you'll have other sports that are more specific also. That doesn't fly for other sports, that stuff I discussed there. So we have got to consider what our sport is asking of us. And I think that's what we did. We classified different movements that are specific to our sport in those contexts.
So were you trying to objectify and put numbers on these 10 skills that maybe the coach was obviously just from intuition and coach's eye was seeing? So you were trying to objectify it for him and break it down?
Yeah, we might go that individually. We might have gone that. We didn't really quantify it. It's qualitative. We maybe record it at times, and you can see straight away if someone doesn't, say for a single leg jump, for instance, you want to take off single leg jump where you're traveling backwards as a center half. If you can visualize a defender doing that crossover and front step and then jumping off one leg to head a ball at the highest point. So the mechanics of that movement should be recorded. Now, it's very difficult to give that a number, but it can be recorded to see where is the breakdown. And what we used to do was, well, I can visualize a player just being a poor header of a ball, right? And in the gym, or me, it's fine. You can find them everywhere, right? They're usually not playing football anymore, but so you can visualize that player, but in the gym they move really well. Counter movement jump might be excellent, single leg jump might be excellent, and all that. And there's some problem about them transferring those skills in the gym and those high outputs in the gym into their sport because they can't win a header. Now, what you can do there is you test them in the kind of the lowest common denominator. Just do a jump in the air first, no ball, okay, and you see, they can get good mechanics. Then you add in other external variables, other factors, like you might cross the ball in, or you might bounce the ball up, or you make them travel a few steps back and then they jump, or even you might put them in the state of fatigue and see where the breakdown of that skill is. And then once you find out where the success is and then where there's not success, then that can teach you a little bit of where you need to train. And I think that is our job as sports scientists. It isn't just to get them stronger in the gym. It isn't just to get them to jump higher. That isn't enough, I don't think. For me, it isn't. And I was never satisfied with that. Like, it only matters if he can now win headers in the game, And I think we can work closely, going back to the first point, work closer with technical coaches, trying to identify where the performance gap is. We have to tick the box in the gym because if they can't jump, they're never going to be able to jump in a different context. Well, ironically, that sometimes does happen, by the way, but typically not. If they don't really jump in any scenario, they're not going to jump in the most complex scenario. But I think there's a gap there to be had. And I think recognizing that gap is just as important as you improving someone's counter movement jump by 10 centimeters.
So in that scenario, let's use centre half because I can definitely rate it. The non-heading 6'4" centre half who seem to get smaller. Yeah, rather than
turtleneck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I can definitely relate to that. Using that scenario, at what point would you involve the coach back into the scenario, back into this situation, this kind of continuum along that, moving along to
Yeah.
improve someone, where would they fit in?
The best thing for me is if you decide that a player is going to improve their performance a lot by improving this skill, I'd involve them from the start. Now, they'll become less involved early doors if you're doing just the strength development, but even if you are doing strength development, there's still mechanics to be improved. And I think a coach needs to intervene there. And then straight away, you've got just a holistic view on the player. And that's important for the player to recognize, because we assume that the player knows, I'm doing this exercise in the gym and that's going to transfer to performance. But rarely that happens. And the younger you get, the less they see the transfer. They don't join the dots quick enough. So for me, if a coach is willing to do it, if a coach is willing to invest in that time, then I believe they're there from the start. And then as they progress up to the skill, and as there's less breakdown of the skill, in terms of a simplistic form, and now you can add in a ball, you can add in a different cross, that's where the coaches take on their own sort of, they take it to a new level, because they see the game differently to we do. But you're still part of the process, I think, there, because you can still make biomechanical changes that may need to happen for success to really unfold, because there may be still an issue with the left hip. It doesn't load properly enough. So he's still not getting enough triple extension, or still not getting a hip extension on that to get him that height that he's asking for. There's just one little bit left. And no matter how much coaching you do, how much reps you do, if that left hip isn't going to load or drive force, then it's not going to translate into height, if you like.
You mentioned right at the start of this little bit about the influence of the sport itself, and understanding it.
Yeah.
I put something into here that's come up a couple of times, but probably more recently, and that's the debate around whether sports scientists and strength and conditioning coaches would actually benefit from a basic technical coaching qualification to get them in tune with how coaches are thinking and how coaches view the world, view the game. Is that something that you'd encourage, or do you not think that's particularly that's maybe going too far?
What I think is the sport really matters. I know a few people have said before that our sports are more similar than they are different and stuff like that, and people have different opinions on it. And I'm not here to say that I think that's wrong, but I disagree with that. I think the sport really matters, and I think the sport is a big driver in my decision making. Now, I didn't do formal coaching badges. I did very small ones, but it doesn't really matter. I don't think you need to have that. I don't think you need to formally go down the process. But if that does help you, I think, why not? I definitely do think you have to spend time analyzing the sport, analyzing the coaches, understanding what they're trying to achieve and where you fit in. Because the sport, for me, determines what the function needs to be and the limitations are. And when you're selecting exercises, if you're not considering the sport, you might be driving some adaptations that are not going to benefit the sport. The example I would use, I'd go remove myself from football a bit. I don't want to talk about football all the time, but say a sport like golf, for instance, right? I see a lot of golfers doing heavy squats, which, okay, it's fine. There's going to be, they're going to get stronger and blah, 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 blah. But one of the adaptations of a squat, and we can't deny this, is that you have to have a stiff spine. If you're going to squat, the more you squat and you're going to lift heavy, your spine you have to brace the musculature system around the spine. You got to brace the spine itself in order to transduce force up and down the body to now lift this weight, to overcome the inertia of the bar or whatever. Now, the squat over time is going to stiffen up the spine, because it's an adaptation that the body will make in order to make you more successful at a squat. Now, if you got a golfer, I would argue that is not the best exercise selection for that athlete. Now, the people are going to jump on and say, well, they need to be stronger. Yes, they do need to be stronger. And I'm not saying that they won't benefit from a generic program and your lower level athlete won't benefit from a generic program. Of course they will. All I'm saying is that there's better ways to do it. It's not the only way to do it, but there's better ways to do it. And I do think we have to consider not only just the primary adaptation of the sport, but the secondary but the secondary adaptations of selecting an exercise that has the impact it has on the body, because it does. And we can avoid it if we want and say it doesn't happen, but I've seen it happen so many times. And it's just my opinion. I'm not trying to enforce my opinion on anybody, but it's just how I see things. And I think that's an important thing to know, especially in my practice. I think that's something you've got to consider.
Just going back to the football and team sport scenario, and using that thought process as the driver for this next little question, I suppose. Is there anything that you see a lot of, or you've seen a lot of, maybe you've done it yourself, that you've then gone through that same thought process as you just explained with the golfer, and thought about the secondary and the tertiary effects of prescribing a certain exercise, and you've moved away from something that you have previously done, or you see a lot and is popular? Is there any examples you could potentially give there?
Yeah, I think one example, I did an article, I didn't publish it yet, was just around the adductors and how we train the adductors. And I think we've become a little bit too obsessed with tension, and how much tension a muscle can generate is generally deemed as a better fit for an athlete. Now, we used to be all about length, like when yoga came around and it was Ryan Giggs with his yoga, and it was all about length and yoga was the best thing. We're kind of come away from that now. It's more strength and tension orientated. But the answer lies in both. Like a muscle needs to have length to allow yourself or the athlete to get into the motion, but then it also has the tension and the capability to get itself out of the motion. And for instance, like if we tend to sometimes just train muscles, and I was guilty of this, just train muscles and muscles will take care of themselves. But we need to train patterns more often, because patterns, I think it was Team X that said this. It was like, I can't think of the quote. I think I wrote it down somewhere. Like if we train patterns, we don't miss muscles, but if we train muscles, we miss patterns. And I think that's a nice way of putting it. But like the Copenhagen's, for instance, are an adductor. There's no doubt they're an adductor exercise. But the demand of the adductor depends on the function of the sport. This is why I'm saying the sport matters. Like the most common way you will pull your adductor longest typically is be the one that you pull the most. But the most common way you'll pull your adductors is the trail leg of a change of direction in sport. If you think I'm here and I'm turning left, it isn't my left leg that will go. It's my right leg. It's my trail leg. I don't know if it's a kind of mirrored image here, but it's my trail leg that goes. So the hip is going into extension first. It's an extension. It's in abduction, and it's in an internal or generally internal rotation, and that is loading the adductor about distally and proximally in all three planes of motion. Now, if we just train the adductor in single plane, in the frontal plane, basically what the adductor hold is for, then I think we miss out on the plane that is most problematic in, if you know what I mean. Because when we stand up, it changes the mechanics completely. It changes the demand of our adductors completely. And I suppose that's a separate podcast to go into that. But so I just think I went down that road of just worrying about tension, and I maybe went down the road of just worrying about length. Now I consider more about patterns and how does it all come together and how does it all fit together. Okay, some certain times, I'm not talking about every time, certain times, at a low level injury, maybe you need some tension to build muscle bulk or whatever it might be. But at some point you got to make the transition, up the chain a little bit, closer to the movement, closer to the mechanics of the sport, closer to the the mechanism of injury. So yeah, I think that's kind of a mistake I maybe made in the past.
So using that adductor as an example, what alternatives and where have you gone with that? Maybe not moving away from the Copenhagen, but just transitioning to something to get all the things that you just explained.
Yeah, so sometimes it's a lot about like recognizing that, okay, the symptom might have been the symptom is not always the problem. It's kind of the analogy of someone keeps banging their head off a wall and they're getting a headache, so you keep treating the headache with Panadol. But if you stop banging your head against the wall, then you wouldn't have a headache. So like sometimes the problem may be the hamstring or the adductors or whatever it might be, but the problem is just their general movement of their hips is causing the pain to be the grind. So I wouldn't necessarily just go after the adductors as a problem. I would look at the biomechanics and I would do a full assessment of the person to figure out why this may be the problem they're having. Because the scenario I would use is like you could have a mechanism for adductors, right? Could be the same mechanism for an MCL and could be the same mechanism where someone is injury free. So the injury a player gets may not be just because of there's an issue with that muscle. It may be because just the biomechanics of the player meant they are more susceptible to that type of injury. So if we don't address the root of the problem, then sometimes we may keep getting recurring, because the grinds are very recurring injury. We may keep getting recurring injuries and we might make them as strong as we possibly can. Like hamstring is a great example. Like if we make the hamstrings as strong as possible, then okay, they're bulletproof. they're bulletproof. Is in some, I made that mistake, and then you keep getting hamstring injuries. But what is it then? Is it strength or is it not strength? And strength, getting stronger doesn't always solve the problem. And I think the only way we solve the problem is looking at it from a holistic point of view, seeing the whole picture, not just the woods, but seeing the forest. And I think that's an important lesson I think I picked up over the last number of years.
That's an interesting little quote, because Eamon Flanagan said exactly the same thing on Mastermind that I did with him and Bouchek Snyder and Joel Smith. Just throw strength. If we're unsure, throw strength at it. But I think he said something like, strength is not the answer to every problem. Strength is the solution to every problem. But we spoke beforehand about a little case study around a hamstring injury, and you've touched on it there a little bit. Would you better take us through that? Is that all right?
Yeah. And this is kind of I have to credit a company called Red Pill and the guys at Red Pill, so James Jousey and Phil Mansfield, who like the reason why I kind of went on this journey was I became very frustrated as a practitioner that I didn't have many more tools than just getting them stronger or whatever, more powerful or hypertrophy or whatever. I felt like that they were great skills to have. But what if a player came into the gym and couldn't load the left hip because he's feeling a little bit of pain on his left, say his split squat, and he was feeling pain in his left hip flex or whatever? My three options were go see a physio, stop doing the exercise, or change the exercise. And I felt that wasn't good enough. Like personally, just felt I wasn't enough as a practitioner. I wasn't given the best service. So I went along this journey and they helped me along this path. They filled a void, if you like, in my delivery. So anyway, having had that sort of journey and I went on I started taking cases that were difficult. So I took a player who was at a professional club, a Premier League club, and he had in his history 8 hamstring injuries, 4 on the left, 4 on the right. And the player was just in distress. Every injury has it needs a rehab, of course, but has a kind of a black mark behind it. You take it with you, right? You fully recover, but it left a mark on the body, if you like, and it's in your passport that you've had hamstring. But having 8 of them, 4 on the left, 4 on the right, and the player felt like not one of them was any good. Do you know what I mean? Not just my left hamstring was a problem, both were. Anyway, so I did a bit of background into him and ask a lot of questions, and we go into the history and you find out how long ago they were and everything else. And then you find out like he's had a really good hamstring program for pretty much his whole career. Like, so he was doing every type of good hamstring exercise you could think of, went through Asling, went through RDLs, went through heavy strength development, went through Nordics, all the stuff that is research based. And we have a lot of validity in selecting, of course, just from the research and everything else, but it wasn't solving his problem. So now this poses a different problem. Where do you go with that? If you only have strength in your tools, what's the next step? And that's where the Red Pill sort of stuff helped me a lot, whereas I started to look then at the forest. So where else is the problem? So the conclusion I came to was that this particular player had a real problem with his foot. So his foot was like a block of ice. It didn't move. You have 26 bones down there for a reason. They're supposed to absorb force. They're supposed to take force when the foot hits the floor, and then they're supposed to lock up again. The muscles around it lock it up, and then it applies force. So recognizing the function of the foot is the first thing. But when it's a block and it's been injected a number of times to be more of a block, which I know it sounds crazy, but that's what actually happened this athlete. Now you've got a foot that when it hits the floor, and as Newton's law suggests, that once the force goes through the body or through the ground, you're getting an equal and opposite reaction from the ground coming up. So, but if you've got a foot that isn't absorbing any forces, and you think of that Newton's cradle, the one with the balls, and you lift one ball at one end and it hits all the balls and it hits the other one at the other end and it just keeps on going. It's like a continuous transfer of force. The force never lost because the balls are rigid. They have a small bit of contact on the balls, and the force transfers quickly through it. That's why if they were sponges, they would stop after 10 seconds. So now his foot is like a Newton's cradle, just transferring force up through the foot into the body. And there's no kind of biomechanical reaction at the foot to take some of the load off at the calf and then up into the hip and the knee. So we did very, very little hamstring-based exercises. We fixed the foot, basically. We got it functioning properly. And now I'm not saying that this is the only thing you need to do. I'm just saying from assessment and where we went with it. And unfortunately, I can say, and I'm not trying to say the world solved or anything, but in this particular case, he's now injury-free 3 years running, and never had a hamstring injury since. Now, that couple of degrees more motion or that couple of degrees more degrees of freedom in the foot has now meant far less force is traveling up through the body. So the body as a system is able to handle those forces. And it might be when muscles do break down, you think of the tensile strength of a muscle, it might just be a few newtons above the breaking force of that muscle to cause the injury to happen. Now, if you can keep your threshold beneath that, no one gets injured, because forces are going to go through the hamstring whether we like it or not. But if we can now get more things into play and lessen the force and lessen the capacity of needed for the hamstring to take this force, then we're less likely to be injuries. And that can happen, again, like I said, from looking at the whole picture, not just the hamstrings in isolation. So that foot seemed to be working for him. It may work for some people, may not work for others, but when you assess the athlete, you assess the function, you assess the limitations, you recognize what the sport demands of him, then you can make the right adjustments, and hopefully you can answer the problem that sometimes strength doesn't always answer.
Would you mind giving us a few more details around what the program looked like for the foot in particular? Is that possible to give a little bit more context around what you were doing to free that foot up, which potentially led to the success you had with the program?
Yeah. So sometimes we select exercise what requires a very stiff foot, like a locked foot, if you like. I'm not sure. I can't remember. I think he had an orthotic in one of the sides as well to kind of stabilize his foot more. When we took that away straight away, and I wanted to teach the foot to do the unlocking and locking. So we started with sort of isolated foot release. So you can kind of put the foot on in an everted state already, and then drive it with the other leg. So you get this kind of flattening of the arch into the space. That's one way of doing it. You can get a therapist to manually distract the calcaneus at the back and then loosen off the mid-tarsal joint. That's something you can also do, and he got that done himself. And then but you can create that sort of 45-degree angle with a weight or whatever else, and then hold on to something and then drive the foot into eversion, and that then releases the foot a little bit. And then you can see if, well, now can I do a lunge and I still get that rotation, or does it still lock up? So just we went through a process of trying to do foot releases in isolation and then trying to bring it into function like a lunge or a lateral lunge or whatever else, because they're very similar to what he has to do when he runs and stuff, in terms of the tibial rotation and the femur rotation and the glute loading and everything else. So, but we started with trying to release the foot, and that was the biggest thing. Now, he got manual treatment, as I said, and we have exercises you can do on. You can use different apparatus really to try and get and the thing is with all this stuff is there isn't one exercise that fits everybody, because I can say a few exercises that we did, but you put it on someone else and it doesn't work for whatever reason. There's something that doesn't. There's a key that fits somewhere. And if you know what you're looking for that release of the foot, you might try. I mean, we tried about 20 exercises until we found something that was actually working for him, and it was the manual therapy that really helped him get that foot unlocked, get that mid-tarsal joint unlocked, and then we can drive it back into function itself. And then he's suddenly feeling his glute when he didn't feel his glute before, because you got that biomechanical reaction up through the body. Because when the foot hits the floor, that's what's going to happen. The calcaneus is going to evert, the talus, the bone up top, is going to fall down and in, which drives internal rotation of the tibia, which then is going to load up the musculature around it, because the bone, once bones move, muscles feel that rotation because they're attached to them, and then they either allow the movement or they pull it back in by muscle spindles that will react to it and pull the bone back to where it is, or where it should be. And then, again, that's either people who can get into movement or can't get out of movement, so he couldn't get into that movement of the foot. So we tried to select as many exercises as we can to get his foot to evert on its own, but then in function.
It's a super complex area, and it's one that's, I think, coming up more and more, especially with S&C coaches, and maybe not, well, yes, the clinical physiotherapy side, but definitely more influenced with the S&C coaches now. Lee Taft spoke about it a lot. Lauren Landau talked about the function of the foot a lot. Is there any particular places that you would go education-wise or upskilling-wise to get to know a bit more about the function and again, talking about the stuff that you've just been talking about?
Yeah, it's quite complicated. There's 26 bones with a lot of attachments at them and all that. You can learn anatomy yourself. You don't need to go anywhere to learn anatomy. And once you know the anatomy and you know the foot, and you know the function of the foot, it's not going to change. Trends will come and go, right? There'll be things that come and go, but the foot isn't changing for as long as we live. The foot. So once you understand the foot, you've got a tool for life, really. The way where I went to was Red Pill. They helped me a lot, and they got me to understand not just the sort of the cartesian of the foot. I don't know if I'm saying them right. Those are the different bones, how they overlap and how they interlink with each other. But they taught me how they actually operate and how they function. And the Red Pill is where I went. I'd recommend anyone going there. It does add some tools, strengths to your bow, I guess, but it added a lot to my practice, really. I didn't get away from the traditional S&C stuff, which is very vital. But as I said to you before, in certain scenarios where strength doesn't work, or an athlete has a pain, or an athlete can't get into movement, then this sort of stuff can supplement it really well and can take yourself to the next level, in my opinion.
Love it. Well, last of the probably 3 or 4 points we wanted to cover for the last 10 or 15 minutes, conditioning versus fitness. I know this is one thing that I'm keen to know your thoughts around this and why you wanted to have a little chat about it, which I'm delighted you suggested it. What's your thoughts around conditioning versus fitness?
It's a topic that I hold close to my heart, really. I like talking about it, and when I discovered a little bit about it was a bit of a eureka moment, really. So, like, for me, fitness is just your general fitness. What a lot of people do, you find fitness anywhere. It could be a 5K, 10K. It's kind of non-specific. It's just general fitness. Conditioning then is more sport related and demands of what you have to do. Because you all know the athlete who can run a 5K, but you put them in or run a 10K, run a marathon, for instance. So they're fit, okay? They're fit, but you put them in a pool or put them on a bike, and they lose all. Like, for me, I can run okay, but I can't swim. Right? And what breaks down there is my condition to swim. Okay, my skill to swim, but also my conditioning in the water is just non-existent, right? So therein lies someone, or you can take on someone else who's really fit in a running capacity, but put them in the context of a sport or something else, they just can't meet the demands of whatever it is. And that's where conditioning comes in. And I think that applies to our sport then. So we went on a bit of a journey at Man City to try and, how can we improve our training? How can we be better in training? How can we be more conditioning specific as opposed to just getting fit? Because we can all do the MAS test. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with MASs or anything wrong with 5Ks or anything. They have their place and they have a certain adaptation to them. But conditioning is then more understanding the demands of the game. It's working at the game and taking one step back and trying to operate in that space rather than taking 4 steps back and doing that fitness. And the way I kind of sort of summarize it is in a continuum, right? So you've got the top of the continuum is the game. And then every time you take a step back, so you might do a conditioning drill with a ball into a finish, whatever, that's a kind of a step closer to the game. But then you might go back and do a MAS run, that's a step behind for me. Or you might do a bike session, that's another step behind. Or you might do a rower session, that's another step behind. Or you might do a circuit, whatever. You can fit all exercise training modalities on a continuum. And the closer they are to the sport, for me, they transfer more to the sport. And this idea got sparked up in me by a discussion I had with Loren, who's Pep Guardiola's coach, and he talked about his way of conditioning. And he showed like all these drills that he does, and he didn't sort of classify it in the way I'm saying it now, but that's how I kind of understood it in my head, that I used to see things in kind of black and white. I used to go, technical one end, if you do 100% tactical work, then you're doing 0% physical because there's no overload. Or if on the other side, if you do 100% physical and you just go after adaptation, typically there's no tactical work there. So there's 2 separate ends, and it has to know what adaptation I'm looking for, and then I go after that, But he spoke about working in the gray area, really. And he mixed a lot of the concepts that Pep was trying to get across, and he integrated his physical elements. So how we went about doing it was, right, let's look at all the tactical and technical elements, our principles, we call them. So things you can't deny, right? So passing, setting, finishing, crossing, all these kind of elements of the game that you need to have. And then on the other side, we listed all the physical qualities that we want to have. So your aerobic endurance, anaerobic, speed, power, whatever it might be. So all the principles on one list. And then we said, right, let's create drills that incorporate many of those skills, if you like, both tactically and technically, but physically also. And can we come up with sessions and drills that induce both, right? And then how do we analyze them? So that's what we developed, a drill, a framework with the principles, because that's important to have principles in your practice. And then we developed drills, and then we analyze those drills across a couple of metrics. So we analyze them across GPS metrics. What do they actually, how close are they to the quantitative analysis of the game? But then also we looked at it from a more of a qualitative sort of coach's intuition, if you like, of the drill. So and there's always this relationship between threshold and skill, right? So if a skill is too high for an athlete, like the skill is too high, it doesn't allow them to induce a threshold. When I say threshold, I'm talking about heart rate response, okay? And if you looked at a game, you would have on average like a beats per minute, about 180 beats per minute in a first half of a game or whatever, right? So in that game, the average beats is 180 per minute, and they have to perform technical and tactical executions in that with high heart rate, right? So that's what we're trying to replicate in training, surely, if we're trying to develop someone. So we would analyze the drill. So how technical did we do it, and how much of an induced physical response did we get looking at heart rate? So what happened a lot of the time was, if we put the skill too high for the individuals that were involved, so demand was too high, we didn't induce much. So they would operate the skill, and sometimes it's too low as well. If the skill was too high, it wasn't hard enough to induce threshold. It's a bit like a pull-up, right? If you can't do pull-ups, you're never going to get a heart rate high enough to do the skill. But if you're good at pull-ups, you can do, say, 8, 10 of them, and you'll get a high heart rate, or burpees or whatever, But then on the flip side is, then if the threshold is too high, then the skill drops down. So it's trying to find that balance of the both together. And I think that's where the best drills that we came up with lay. Sometimes you have to separate them. Sometimes it's just the technical. But the end goal is about developing the threshold, the endurance, the aerobic capacity, whatever, in a skill-induced environment, because they have to perform skills when they're fatigued or close to our high heart rate. You and me kicked around the ball, we'd be fine, but then suddenly you drive our heart rate up through the roof, then our skill breaks down. Why? Because we can't perform the skills at high level of physical exertion, if you like.
Is it Loren?
Yeah.
Okay. Is his background a coaching background, or is it a sports background?
I believe so. I mean, he's that good on the field. He must have some kind of coach. But he's been around one of the best coaches in the world for so many years. He would have learned a lot of lessons along the way. But again, that's a good practitioner who's able to see the game, able to develop. And you wouldn't really necessarily see the first team doing a lot of mass runs and everything else. And sometimes you go, why are they not doing this stuff? But when you analyze the game, and this is why the sport matters, and you realize what's important, and Pep's teams are physically good also, but they're very efficient, I would say. They know their roles, they know where to be. So they have both together, and that's really important to get across. And then your team, and a team might be different. It might be a running game that you need, so you might need more mass runs. This is the whole why sport matters, but also the context matters. But for us, when we're at Man City, you wanted technically good players, you wanted tactically astute players, and you needed physically decent players also. But they had to do them in the context of their position and their role on the pitch, and that was important to understand. So we blend them better together. One, you get more buy-in, which obviously is a secondary point, but I think two, you're now tackling the conditioning element as opposed to just going after the fitness element.
Sorry to dumb it down and get you to give examples again, but is there any examples of drills that you came up with which you can potentially communicate to paint the picture? Maybe ticked I don't know, a really good physical box that you wanted, but also incorporated something interesting on the technical side. Is that possible?
Yeah, it's hard, I suppose, because the videos is the best way to get it across. Yeah. But like how we analyzed it was, we would sit with the coaches and design these drills and go, right, okay, what technical elements are you going to get? So I want them to be doing a lot of crossing under fatigue, say for the fullbacks. And then, okay, today they need a more aerobic stimulus. So they might have done sort of high heart rate, change of direction, not a lot of rest, and then going into like a sprint to cross a ball, receive a ball and cross, and have to sprint back again and continuous for like 3-4 minutes, and seeing how successful they are crossing the ball as their heart rate goes up, and that's just a simple drill, of course, but we would do other things whereby, if we were playing, and this is where the tactical started to come into it. I remember we were playing Inter Milan, and the way we could have beat Inter Milan was playing a pass in between the fullback and the centre half, and we would just set up the drill where a pass would be played in that position, but we would start to run very fast because I wanted sprint distance, I wanted high speed running in the session. So we would manipulate the play and then obviously it's long rest because you're getting high end stuff, so it's not aerobically challenged, but there's a few passing sequence into a long pass that goes in between the two positions that I mentioned, and then it's a big sprint to get on the end of it. Now we didn't put any goalkeeper in there because we didn't want the finishing to kind of take away from the physical, if you know what I mean. If we put in finishing there might have been a shorter run because you now have to perform a skill at the end of the run. So all these kind of things kind of manipulate each other, and it's kind of like a slide rule. And the thing to say is it was very messy to begin with. Like it was, we were almost better off doing the mass stuff and doing the other stuff and doing it separate. But we knew we didn't want to always work in that way. We wanted to develop a library of drills that we could pull upon, that we know were useful, were good, and the players bought into it really. And sometimes you'd have to utilize your staff because we'd separate up positions. So the centre halves and the fullbacks would do something, and then the midfielders and the striker would do something, and then the wide players would do something different, because obviously you have to understand what people are capable of also, it can't just be caution to the wind on that front. But yeah, so we went around that route, and the premise of it all was to go, look, can we condition them better than just get them fit? Because if you don't do that, like I remember when we play games in, say, a checker trade, so these kids are only 17 playing against men, and we would have obviously play the ball, play like nice brand of football, but give away the ball at the worst point and just be exposed and have to do these transition runs. So as fit as we could be, we could do the runs all day if we wanted, but the problem was we kept on giving the ball away up top, so we didn't train skill with fitness, if you know what I mean. So it's important that, and if you don't give the ball away, you have to do less runs. So it's better to be 10% more proficient with fitness than it is to just be 15% fitter, because you're never going to solve the problems if you just keep bashing away at the fitness alone in isolation, I think, in my opinion.
That's interesting. It's the grey area, because like majority of sports scientists, again, scientists being the title, black and white, like everything in the box, everything in a spreadsheet, color-coded, nice and smart, MAS run, everyone's going from A to B, and it's all regimented and it's all black and white. It's easily managed. And then you get into this, what you just described, and it's all over the place, and you're kind of figuring it out as you go, and it's a little bit chaotic. I'm guessing people become nervous at that point because it's not how we're programmed as sports scientists to have an answer and a box for everything.
And that's why that's a great point, because that's exactly, so I heard all this stuff and goes, it makes sense, I can't deny this doesn't make sense, but in my head I had to sort of make it a bit more Excel-y, if you like, and I had to go, all right, what are the principles? I had to kind of have a process behind it too, because I think if it was too airy-fairy, it wouldn't sit right with me. But then I had a structure behind it, it made a bit of sense, there was a bit of logic to it. And then when the process unfolds, it's a bit more arty also, because you're right, like you can get people to do mass runs, you can predict everything, you can go, all right, today they did 107.5% of their MAS, and you can mark it out with a meter stick. I did all that too, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that's great for preseason. Now you're separating the skill completely from the threshold stuff, and you're doing the threshold very well, but at some point, somewhere, if you're going to get the biggest transfer across, you have got to blend them in together. And I don't think you can just rely on training to do that. I think you have to go out and purposely try and design your training to get that out of it.
Cool. Well, I think we've covered all the points, and I've been enthralled, and I'm even more enthralled with David Silva shirt behind you, which is superbly placed.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I bought that today. I got it printed today as
well. But no, it's been great to chat to you, and congratulations. I mean, I think I messaged you on the day, but I'm a few months late with the Scottish qualification, because that's obviously a big thing for you guys. Be interesting to see what happens next summer.
Yeah, it will be interesting. No, that was a great day. That was really good, and obviously, I've just been privileged to be part of that. That's been a team building for so many years under Graham and his team as well. So it's nice to be part of it. Graham will always joke I just jumped on the bandwagon at the right time, but hopefully you help, in the best way you can. But it's a real privilege to be part of a team like that.
No, it's been brilliant to chat to you, mate. Thank you for coming on. If anyone's got any questions for you based on this or anything else, what's the best place for people to get in touch?
Yeah, it's probably social media, to be honest. So on Instagram, SDM Performance. If you want to send me a private message or whatever, happy to do it. Just Twitter. It's usually SDM Performance is the social handle. So yeah, just reach out that way if you want. Yeah, or Shayne at sdmperformance.com.
Perfect. SDM.
Yeah. SDM, yeah.
Perfect.
Shayne David Murphy, yeah.
Happy days.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much
Rob.
for your time. Thank you for giving up your evening to have a chat. Really appreciate it. Apologies for taking so long to get you on. It was worth the wait.
Oh yeah.
Thanks, mate.
Man.
Appreciate it.
No worries, Rob.
Speak soon.
Thank you.
Bye, mate.
Speak soon, mate. Bye-bye.